Hello, and welcome to Cosmic Dream Sanctuary. This is an inquiry into the words the phenomena and UAP, especially as a euphemism. We are going to explore the philosophical, historical, and ethical implications of using the phenomena to refer to psychic people in spacecraft. And yes, I did say that we are going to look into the philosophic, historical, and ethical implications of using the words the phenomena to refer to psychic people in spacecraft. This inquiry is presented by me, Daniel Rekshan. I hold a bachelor's degree in the Western Liberal Arts from the St. John's College in Annapolis, Maryland. I hold a master's degree in East-West Psychology from the California Institute of Integral Studies, CHT in depth hypnosis, a certificate in beyond quantum healing, and I'm ordained as a minister in the Universal Life Church. I use these credentials to serve people in hypnosis and dream work who have had extraterrestrial encounters or other strange phenomena. And so I am offering this inquiry from the perspective as a student of philosophy and liberal arts, as a scholar of psychology, and as a practitioner in this field. So why is this relevant? Why inquire into the usage of a funny word, the phenomena? Well, we now use a word and phrase that has significant historical, philosophic, and political context that is not well understood. So we see people refer to UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomena. Why did it shift from UFO, an object, into a phenomena? Why are we using the phrase the phenomena to refer to what is quite obviously, especially when we consider the testimony of people who have seen these things, interacted with them, why are we using the term phenomena when in reality, these people seem to be interacting with people or entities that are psychic in nature, just like we are, who have interacted with us through the intermediary activity of a spacecraft, right? This is what people say. Why don't we take them seriously? And it seems to me that we are using the phrase the phenomena euphemistically because there are triggers and taboos associated with calling it as it is, psychic people in spacecraft. So it's really important to know that the usage of this word and the behavior of the U.S. Congress in its recent historic public hearing are actually incongruent with the greater context of the word phenomena. So once again, the usage of the word phenomena in the context of UAP and also in the context of discussion in the public space, such as that U.S. Congressional hearing, is inconsistent, incongruent with the historic, philosophic, and scientific use of the word phenomena. At the end of this talk, you should be able to understand the historic and philosophic implications of this word. You should be able to understand its current usage as euphemistic. And finally, you should understand the ethical perspectives involved in scientific dialogue and using narrative evidence. So an overview of this talk is we'll talk about phenomena, euphemisms, the use of the word, and as well as the implication, right? The fundamental implication here is that when we use the word phenomena, it implies an intellectual stance, it implies a worldview, and that stance is actually engagement through an intellectual process that is commonly called dialectic. So this is a fancy word for simply logical dialogue. We'll cover definitions, all of the definitions that are relevant here: euphemism, phenomena, noumena or essence, phenomenology, ontological significance, dialectic, logos and logic, mythology and mythos, ontological shock, scientific revolution, and UFO UAP. We'll cover the history, particularly looking at Platonic and Socratic history, where this division between phenomena that we can study and see and an essence of that is really starting to be discussed. Plato actually presents in the life and dialogues of Socrates a very potent example that we should be looking to here and now, especially in the context of how we handle mythological dialogue, especially in the context of empire, and especially because it literally leads to martyrdom. So Socrates was murdered by the Athenian Empire because of his insistence on relying upon mythological narrative data. And if anybody has watched the U.S. Congressional Hearing on this, we might understand that the narrative anecdotal data surrounding the phenomena actually is at risk of being cut off, and those people who use mythological means of knowledge, aka anecdotal, testimonial, and qualitative research methodologies, of which phenomenology is one research methodology, we're at a risk of being persecuted by law because it is maybe deemed disinformation in regards to the more physical and sensor-based technology. I would say, let's just bring some sophistication to the dialogue and understand we have quantitative and qualitative research methodologies. We'll cover the birth of modern phenomenology through the philosophers such as Kant, Enlightenment. We'll talk about the Phenomenologists. We'll talk about the dialectic, which is how phenomenology unfolds through history. And we'll talk about phenomenology as a quantitative research methodology that is very popular in academic research. I'll offer some reflections primarily around the etiquette involved in using the word phenomena. We'll look at the transition from UFO to UAP, and then we'll also analyze some of the main points of the U.S. Congressional Hearing, especially in regards to the nature of the phenomenon. We'll also talk about some of the context and ethics here in our conclusion. So these are the conclusion points. You're actually invited to intellectual participation through dialectic when we use the word phenomena. Your narrative story is meaningful as a meaningful way of knowledge. I would say let's not repeat history by creating martyrs here. Let's actually just receive the mythological or narrative-based testimony in the way that is meaningful for us. It's important to know that categories like physical and psychical have the same epistemological status as mythology. That is to say, they're derivative or relating to a predefined worldview, and that you're encouraged to advance humanity through scientific revolution. So we're going to talk about those. It's really important to know there's some ethics involved in this dialogue. Mainly that when we switch from sensor-based quantitative data, logical data, it's important to shift and verbally acknowledge we are talking now about mythology, something like that. One of the ethical principles I would put forward is to use the actual categories that are applicable. For example, use the term spaceship, not UAP. Use the term psychic space person rather than non-human intelligence, because it doesn't do us any service to talk in euphemisms, right? We need to respect the experiencer as the authority regarding the ontological significance of their narrative. And it's important to know that when you feel triggered, it is your choice to expand your worldview. This is what the triggering is inviting, is an investigation into why you think some of these things are taboo. And that may involve challenging memories or experiences and things like that. And finally, it's important to understand that the phenomena invites, that using the word phenomena implies an invitation to an intellectual process that has been going on since before the time of Socrates and Plato. So I did mention trigger warning. And I want to provide the definition of euphemism, because this is really the premise here, is that we are using the word the phenomena or unidentified aerial phenomena or even unidentified flying object as a euphemism. So what is a euphemism? Well, it is the use of a word or a phrase to replace another one with one that is considered less offensive, blunt, or vulgar than the word or phrase which it replaces. So we're replacing a word. In this case, I would put forward, we're replacing the notion of psychic space people in spacecraft with non-human intelligences within unidentified aerial phenomena. So it's important to know that we replace these things primarily because the taboo, right? The offensive quality of it deals with our worldview. And our worldview is such, it says, we live in a material world. There's no one else out there. We're the pinnacle of progress, right? And we're just our bodies, right? That's what it's saying. As it turns out, we are not the pinnacle of progress on the earth. We are not alone in the cosmos, that our technologies are not superior to other people in our own vicinity. And this is triggering to a nation state that has fetishized war and military industrial activities for its entire existence. So this is a very triggering topic. And therefore, if you do feel triggered by discussions around politics, religion, worldview, then I would invite you to practice mindfulness, right? So we can practice mindfulness by coming back to a non-judgmental awareness of the present moment. You can do that by tuning into your breath as we go through there. If you think you actually will be triggered by this discussion, right, by the notion that we are not alone, by the notion that these UFOs are actually, in some cases, spacecraft piloted by psychic people, right, then I'd invite you to come back to this inquiry at some future time where you feel much more resilient. I would say that if you are curious and you've made it this far, that you likely have the capacity to navigate that sense of triggering and likely have the sense to integrate some of these deeper experiences and inquiries. So once again, thank you for being here. So just by way of introducing, what are we talking about when we talk about the phenomenon? So a Google Trends search for the phrase "the phenomena" is shown here. We see kind of a standard horizontal trend line until about 2020, at which point it spikes. So at that point in 2020, we were shifting from UFO to UAP, which is unidentified flying object, to unidentified aerial phenomena. We were also talking about the Nimitz encounters and things like that. And then also the documentary, The Phenomena, came out. There's a podcast called Engaging the Phenomena. So this is what we're talking about. Why are we using this word? What is this word phenomena? How is it coming about? So how is it euphemistic? What is it replacing, right? And so we can look to the only scientific statistical study of interactions with non-human intelligences associated with unidentified aerial phenomena, right? And that is the Beyond UFO study put out by Dr. Edgar Mitchell's Foundation for Research into Extraterrestrial and Extraordinary Experiences. It is a survey of more than 4,000 individuals. And so I'll just simply say that the percentage responding yes, looking at this table, the percentage responding yes to seeing an intelligently controlled craft reported by subject country of origin. So 73% of the people who came from, who 70% of the people in the United States said they saw intelligently controlled craft. 62% of the people who responded to the survey from Canada said yes, they saw intelligently controlled craft. And it goes on like that for the major, the top 5 countries of the response of the survey. They asked, did it stay still or hover? About 50%, it floats around there. People say that's what happened. About in the 30s%, did it make impossible maneuvers? So this is highly strange behavior. Did it disappear quickly? Again, something like 40% says that. And so were there multiple witnesses? There was a significant minority in all of the countries of response. So this is really, so we're looking at something like a global phenomena that exhibits intelligently controlled craft, right? So are there any other anomalous experiences happening with them? Like, do watches malfunction or stop? Have electronics malfunctioned around you? Have you experienced any missing time? 30 to 40% of all the countries generally have said that, right? That's incredible. Were you fully awake and found yourself in a new location? Have you seen strange lights in your home with no known sources? So this is really a phenomenological description of UFO encounters in people's lives. And you can really see these rates here looking at the top 5 countries that have responded to this survey. This, as you can see, represents at least 2,600 people. The survey itself had about 4,000. So these are, there was some process of vetting these reports. And I would actually give you a sense of comparison. The database that is discussed in the United States Congressional Hearing was around 400 reports. So here we have a higher number, and it's across the world, and it involves anecdotal data somewhat. So we're talking about people or beings and not a generic non-human intelligence, right? Even though they say the types of non-human intelligent beings encountered in the response to the question, how would you describe these experiences with these entities, right? So we have a list here. People are seeing energy beings, human-looking beings. About 52% of people who have interactions with non-human intelligences associated with UAPs say, yeah, hey, they're human-looking. Short gray is another type, spirit, tall gray, reptilian, hybrid, insectoid, and animal type. So there's a number of beings seen associated with these, as well as positive and negative percents. It should be noted that most are generally positive or neutral as opposed to negative. And so this is what we're talking about when we talk about non-human intelligences. And if we go back to the last slide, we're talking about strange spacecraft that bring these non-human intelligence, these psychic beings, into relation with humans. So that's what we're talking about. That's what's standing in place. So another thing to note, right, is that the psi phenomena that we're talking about, the psychic aspect of these psychic space people, is specific and real. It is not a generic the phenomena. So again, this is the use of euphemistic the phenomena to stand in the place of what actually happened, right? So these people responding to the survey said in general, right, they've had out-of-body experience, near-death experience. They were medically healed. There's medical healings by a non-human intelligence. 50% of respondents say that. We're not talking about the phenomena. We're talking about miraculous healings from beings that seem like psychic space people. Have you had contact with a non-human intelligence in a matrix-like reality? Half the people said that. Past life memories. This is what we're talking about. Even though it might be uncomfortable for our consensus reality worldview, we're actually talking about significant experiences. Like seeing auras, feeling auras. We're talking about this. We're not talking about a generic phenomena. We're talking about specific and real phenomena. And if you doubt that psi phenomena are real, please just look at the scientifically repeatable studies that really show that, yes, psi phenomena are indeed real. They have a weak but significant effect, So basically, everyone you know is like a bad telepath unless they've had training in it or something like that. So this is the human capacity. We are psionic in nature. So once again, let's turn back to definitions. We're in the definition phase now that we talked about what actually is going on, and a euphemism is what's going on. And so it comes from the ancient Greek word euphemismos, and that means euphemos is an uttering sound of good omen, abstaining from inauspicious words. So that's really important to know. Eu meaning well, phemi, a voice, a prophetic voice, rumor or talk, and phane, meaning to say or to speak. Once again, it's defined as the use of a word or phrase to replace another with one that is considered less offensive, blunt, vulgar than the phrase or word it replaces. So what is a phenomenon? So phenomena comes from the ancient Greek, meaning thing appearing to view. And it comes from the word theino, which means I show. So it involves a sense of appearance, a sense of showing. We define it as a thing or a being, an event or a process, perceptible through the senses, or a fact or occurrence thereof. By extension, it is a knowable thing or event, such as an electromagnetic phenomena. It's any kind or type of phenomena, such as a volcanic eruption is an impressive phenomenon. It is an appearance, a perceptible aspect of something that is mutable. It is a fact or event considered very unusual, curious, astonishing by those who witness it. And I would say, indeed, the phenomena is highly strange. That's one of its characteristics. And it is also defined as a wonderful or very remarkable person or thing. And finally, in the context of philosophy, chiefly Kantian idealism, and we'll talk about that later, it is an experienced object whose constitution reflects the order and conceptual structure imposed upon it by the human mind, especially by the powers of perception and understanding. So this is a really important definition. We'll pull it apart later. But I want you to start knowing that phenomena in some way, shape, are sense data apprehended by the consciousness through the mediation of predefined concepts and categories of perception, right? So that's really important. We go, oh, is it a bird? No. Is it a plane? No. Is it a stranger ball lightning? No. Did it behave like this, that, the other thing? Yes. Did you feel a psychic experience? So now we're going from the phenomenological data, the sense data. I saw this. We're going through categories of perception, bird, plane, whatever, to actually say, oh, it's an unidentified aerial phenomenon. Actually, the category here is spacecraft driven by psychic space people. It is not a generic unidentified phenomena because we've gone through the work of identifying it. And that's really why we're doing this inquiry. We're pulling it apart. All right, noumenon. Again, this is from ancient Greek, meaning thing that is known, from the word nous, that generally means mind. I know, but nous, N-O-U-S, means of or relating to the mind. So again, the only definition is from Kantian philosophy, but it is a thing as it is, independent of any conceptualization or perception by the human mind, postulated by practical reason, but existing in a condition which is in principle unknowable and unexperienceable. So here, this case is like, what are we trying to know? We're trying to know that the nature or essence of a thing, right? We use our minds to deduce, oh, okay, so if we're looking at an apple, let's say, we're receiving sense data, smell, sight, and we go, okay, it's round, it's red, it smells like an apple. I think it's an apple. But actually, can the rational mind step and somehow participate or understand or deeply know the essence of that apple experience? No, you're actually just dealing with sense perception. So that's a thing. So the thing in itself versus the sense perception, right? Or the phenomenon. Essence is a really important word to know because when we talk about phenomenology in a research context, one of the purposes is to know the essence of a thing. So what is the essence? And it comes from Latin, from essentia, the being or essence of a thing. And that comes ultimately from Greek, from ousia, being, which comes from the emi, meaning I am, I exist. So ousia, which is really important to know because we're going to explore ontological things, which refer to the beingness of something. But the essence here may be defined as the inherent nature of a thing or idea, the true nature of anything, not accidental or illusory, a constituent substance, a being, especially a purely spiritual being, a significant feature of something, the concentrated form of a plant or a drug obtained through a distillation process, an extract or concentrate obtained from a plant or other matter using flavoring, or as a restorative, and then finally a fragrance or perfume. So essence, this is really, you know what it is. It's the beingness of a thing. It's the core of a thing. And we're trying to reach that through our qualitative research methodologies of phenomenology. So ontology is a really important word to understand because we'll be talking about the nature of ontological shock, which is put forward by Dr. John Mack. Ontological shock is the reason why we are using euphemisms, the euphemism of phenomenology, the phenomena, to discuss things as opposed to just saying what it is. Psychic people in strange spacecraft, right? We don't say that in general because that implies an ontological shock. So let's understand what the word ontology refers to. This comes from the ancient Greek ontos, meaning being, plus logos, which is another important word. Logos, in this case, they define it as account, but we might also remember logical or ology, like theology, philosophy is love of wisdom, ology, right? So ontology here is defined as the branch of metaphysics that addresses the nature and essential characteristics of a being of things that exist. In a subject view or a worldview, the set of conceptual or material things or classes of things that are recognized as existing or are assumed to exist in context and their interrelation in a body of theory. The ontology comprises the domain of discourse, right? The things that are defined as existing, together with whatever emerges from their mutual implications. It is the theory of a particular philosopher or school of thought concerning the fundamental types of entities in the universe. In logic, it is a logical system involving theories of classes developed by Stanislaw Leszczynski. And finally, we have the definition, a structure of concepts or entities within a domain organized by relationships. It's a system model. So when we talk about ontological shock, we're talking about the shift of this definition, these categories of perception we have. We're not talking necessarily about the noumenal world, right? The noumena. We're talking about the phenomena and how we perceive, how we make sense of sense data, not actually what the sense data is or what the sense data is of, but this intellectual process, right? So now let's talk about logic or logos. Again, it's coming from the ancient Greek logos, meaning speech or reason. So in the case of logic, we have definitions: a method of human thought that involves thinking in a linear, step-by-step manner about how a problem can be solved. Logic is the basis of many principles, including the scientific method. In philosophy, the study of principles and criteria of valid inference and demonstration, the mathematical study of relationships between rigorously defined concepts and of mathematical proof of statements. It is a formal or informal language together with a deductive system. Is any system of thought, whether rigorous or productive or not, especially associated with a particular person. It's hard to work out his logic, is the example. And then finally, we've got the definition, the part of a system, usually electronic, that performs the Boolean logic operation, short for logic gates or logic circuits. So we've got this step-by-step type of thought. It is somewhat systematized, and there is a sense of rigor to it. So it's important to know that when we deal with phenomenology, right? This is referring to the logic of phenomena, right? There is a sense of rigor to it. So when we use the word phenomenon to describe these things, we are actually invoking a rigorous system of human thought. And this is really important. This is the core message. When we say, hey, the phenomena did this, the phenomena did that, we're actually invoking a human system of thought that demands our participation. We are not passive observers. We are active participants in the historical unfolding of this logical dialogue, which we call the dialectic. All right. So let's go on to myth and mythology. So in the case of Plato, he understands that there is multiple ways of knowledge. One is discursive reasoning, this sort of deductive reasoning of logic. The other one is expressed word. Knowledge as speech as a way of knowledge. So in this case, we're dealing with mythos, word, humor, companion, or speech, account, rumor, or fable. This is ancient Greek. If you look into the definitions of ancient Greek, there's not a sense of illusion. There's not a sense of falseness that we associate with mythology now. We go, oh, the Greek gods, they had their mythology, right? They thought, ha ha ha, look, Zeus was so funny. How could they think he's a god? Actually, the mythology is just a spoken tale of what happened before. So that's really important to know. We define myth here as a traditional story which embodies a belief regarding some fact or phenomenon of experience, and in which often the forces of nature and of the soul are personified. It is a sacred narrative regarding a god, a hero, or the origin of the world or of a person. So it is such stories as a genre. Then there are a definition of commonly held but false belief, a common misconception. And this is really not the case in the Greek definition. It's important to know. This is a new thing. A fictitious or imaginary person or thing, and so on. For definition 4, a person or thing held in excessive or quasi-religious awe or admiration, and a person or thing existing only in the imagination or whose actual experience is not verified. And again, I would say, as someone who has studied the human imagination, this is not a statement that is ontologically significant to say only in the imagination, primarily because our imagination has our capacity is one of our capacities to touch into the noumenon world, the world beyond phenomena. Let's talk about the word dialectic. Dialectic is really important. It's a funny word that you may or may not have heard. It comes from the ancient Greek, and that word is the art of argument through interactive questioning and answering. And that comes from originally dialegomai, meaning to participate in a dialogue, right? And again, it comes from the prefix dia, through or across, and legion, which comes from logos, meaning to speak. So to speak through or across. So dialectic we can define as any formal system of reasoning that arrives at a truth by the exchange of logical arguments. 2, it's a contradiction of ideas that serves as the determining factor in their interaction. Or 3, the progress of conflict, especially class conflict. So when we use the term phenomena, we are establishing ourselves, we are establishing our intellectual stance in the context of a historical dialectic. This is the technical expression of what you need to know. If you use the word the phenomena, if you use the word UAP, you are actually establishing yourself in a dialogue, the dialectic that has continued through the Enlightenment all the way back to Plato, in terms of how this discourse is happening. It's not a thing that has happened in the 60s and beyond. It's not a thing that happened in 2017 when the New York Times started talking about it. This dialectic has been continuing since the initial interactions of Socrates with a being that seems to be a psychic space person or a demonic entity, meaning intermediary being. With that, let's come to the ontological shock. This is really important to understand because this is why we're using euphemisms, is ontological shock. We've run through some of the definitions. Please remember that ontology refers to the logic of being, and it refers to a system of concepts that we hold in our mind, that we apply to sense data to say this thing is real and that thing's not. And you'll actually see ontology at work when you look through the U.S. Congressional Hearing. At the end of this presentation, we'll actually step through some of the quotes from there, and they go, is it a physical object? I mean, is it solid or is it gas, right? So this is an ontology. They did not include in their ontology units of consciousness. They did not include in their ontology psychic events. And that is why they rejected narrative accounts for favor of censored data, because their pre-existing ontology says physical things are real, imaginal things are not. So that's really important to know. I'll read from the book Abduction by Dr. John Mack. Dr. John Mack was the Harvard psychiatrist hired by the U.S. government to look into the sanity of pilots who reported UFOs and interactions with extraterrestrial beings, non-human intelligences. His mind was opened. He saw, oh, wow, something actually is happening. These people are reputable. Something here is happening. And so he describes this term ontological shock. And I'll just read here from his book. Abductees experience what I have called ontological shock as the reality of their encounters sink in. They, like all of us, have been raised in the belief that we on Earth are largely alone in the universe, and that it would simply not be possible for intelligent beings to enter into our world without using a highly advanced form of our technology and obeying the laws of our physics. Abductees tend to persist in the hope that a psychological explanation for their experiences will be found, even when they tell me that what has happened to them is as real as the conversation that we are having. The alien beings that the abductee speaks about seems to many of them to come from another domain that is felt to be closer to the source of being or primary creation. They have been described, however homely their appearance, as intermediaries or emissaries from God, even as angels, by Carlos, for one. Carlos is one of the case studies here. And it's important to call out the sense of intermediary beings that are closer to the source of being. So these are the words that Socrates used to describe the demonic entity that he interacted with after participating in the Eleusinian mysteries, which was something like a psychedelic cult. So basically he did some psychedelics in a temple or a cave-like situation. His mind was open. He started interacting with an intermediary being who started to provide him information about the immortality of the soul, about how to live a good and well life. Back to the text. The acknowledgement of their existence after the initial ontological shock is sometimes the first step in the opening of consciousness to a universe that is no longer simply material. Abductees come to appreciate that the universe is filled with intelligences and is itself intelligent. They develop a sense of awe before a mysterious cosmos that becomes sacred and ensouled. The sense of separation from all the rest of creation breaks down, and the experience of oneness becomes an essential aspect of the evolution of the abductee's consciousness. So once again, please do know that we are talking about relating to an intelligent, ensouled cosmos, and this is really what's at stake. And so when we think about only limiting our predefined categories of perception, not limiting our sense data, not limiting what's in the world, but we just limit our categories of perception to physical, is it solid or gas, right? This divorces us from this possibility of deeper experience and deeper connection with a beautiful, mysterious cosmos. So let's talk about what's going on in terms of scientific revolution. So let's turn to the work of Thomas Kuhn, who wrote a book, The Structure of the Scientific Revolutions. If you know anything about history and philosophy of science, you've likely encountered this book. It really describes how scientific revolutions unfold, and he says it unfolds in phases. And I'll just read from the Wikipedia article here because it summarizes it pretty well. So Kuhn explains the process of scientific change as the results of various phases of a paradigm change. Phase 1, it exists only once and is the pre-paradigm phase, in which there is no consensus on any particular theory. This phase is characterized by several incompatible theories. Consequently, most scientific inquiry takes the form of lengthy books, aka thank you, Dr. John Mack, for his long book, Abduction. Takes the form of lengthy books as there are no common body of facts that may be taken for granted. If the actors in the pre-paradigm community eventually gravitate to one of these conceptual frameworks and ultimately a widespread consensus on the appropriate choice of methods, terminology, and the kinds of experiments that are likely to contribute to increased insight. Phase 2 is normal science begins, in which puzzles are solved within the context of the dominant paradigm. As long as there is consensus within the discipline, normal science continues. Over time, progress in normal science may reveal anomalies, facts that are difficult to explain within the context of the existing paradigm. While usually these anomalies are resolved, in some cases they may accumulate to the point where normal science becomes difficult and where weaknesses in the old paradigm are revealed, aka the anomalous experience of thousands of experiencers that are reputable, right? Phase 3, if the paradigm proves if the paradigm proves chronically unable to account for anomalies, the scientific community enters a crisis period. Crises are often resolved within the context of normal science. However, after significant efforts of normal science, within a paradigm fail, science may enter the next phase. So I say this is kind of where we're at. We've seen it failed. I mean, it's really failed in terms of supporting the implications of worldview as put forward by these experiencers, which is one of a conscious worldview, of consciousness, not just matter, of consciousness, of psionic phenomena, of the observer principle, of some of these things that we've been seeing in quantum physics. So phase 4 is the paradigm shift or the scientific revolution. It is the phase in which the underlying assumptions of the field are re-examined and a new paradigm is established, right? And maybe we're here now. Wouldn't that be wonderful? And then phase 5, post-revolution, the new paradigm's dominance is established, and so scientists return to normal science, solving puzzles within the new paradigm. Wouldn't that be wonderful? As science may go through these cycles repeatedly, though Thomas Kuhn notes that it is a good thing for science that such shifts do not occur often or easily. So some definitions that we need to talk about are UFO and UAP. UFO stands for unidentified flying object. UAP stands for unidentified aerial phenomena. I've made this table to talk about the ontology. So when we say UFO, we're saying it's an object. We kind of assume it's an object in itself. It's assumed to be physical. When we use the word phenomena, it's a collection of sense data. Actually, we're saying, hey, we don't actually know what the thing in itself is, but it is a collection of sense data. If you've got good scientists and good reporters, they're inclusive of the psi phenomena, because this is actually very prevalent in the case of experiencers. Probably about 80% of the people who have report interactions with non-human intelligences and UAPs talk about psionic contact. So this needs to be included. Jacques Vallée includes psionic contact in his 6 layers of understanding a UAP event. So it's really important. In the past, they may have burnt those records. They push them aside. They don't know what to do with it according to their current categories of sense perception, aka the worldview that the investigators are in, so they ignore psi phenomena. But it's important to know UAP is actually inclusive of that, because phenomena implies that we are investigating the categories of sense perception. So what is the causality happening here? Well, with UFO, we see that it is within the self of the object. In the beingness of that object, it is flying. That's how it's defined. In UAP, we don't know. What is the essence of this? It's like knowable as such. Okay, there's an object. Let's study it through sensor data. Let's study it through these different reports or different methodologies or things like that. But in the case of UAP, it is knowable through dialectic, meaning we need to engage in a dialogue, a logical dialogue that involves many different things. But that's how we understand phenomena. That's not how we understand objects. So we're shifting from going, okay, hey, we know what this object is, to, okay, here, this is a collection of data. What do we make of it? And we use the dialectic to make something of it. So what is the euphemism, right, for UFO? Well, it's euphemistic. It's replacing ET spacecraft. That's what it is, right? We think these are ET. That's what they tell us. Who knows? I mean, maybe they're fairies, like Jacques Vallée says, but for all intents and purposes, they seem to be spacecraft of psychic people. With the case of UAP, it is a euphemism for a more specific ontological category. So in this case, we may actually say, oh, okay, the UAP is a light being. We're seeing a light being. It's an orb. It's a spacecraft. It's whatever, right? So it gives a more sense of definition, right? So what is the implied perspective involved with UFO or UAP? UFO means it's an object. It's out there. It's flying. We don't know what it is. Let's observe it as passive observers. With UAP, though, it means we're getting sense data in, but if we're using the word phenomena, it actually implies an active participation in this dialectic, in this understanding. You're no longer a passive observer. You're actually a participant in a phenomenological dialectic, which is a rigorous course of human thought that most of us don't actually talk about, but those of us who have studied history and philosophy and understand that words have power, we understand that using this word phenomena invites us to active participation in the intellectual understanding of these phenomena. Great, so let's start with history. How do we do this? Well, let's go back. I mean, they were philosophy 2,000 years ago, they weren't stupid back then. They knew things, right? And our historical record really allows for us to understand certain patterns. And I would say this pattern around Socrates and Plato is one of the most important and most relevant to this discussion here and now. Because who was Plato? Okay, let's talk about this before we get into some more of the context, because it's really, you really need to know. So 2,500 years ago, 600 years ago, 2,600 years ago, there was a man named Plato. He wrote a bunch of plays, and all of these plays were dialogues between Socrates and different characters within the context of this ancient Greek city-state of Athens. So Athens is at a time of sort of like flourishing. It's becoming an empire. These things are happening. And Socrates really wanted to encourage and educate, to bring a good way of being, political being, right? So there's a political end, meaning being in a good way as an empire, right? And how are we doing that? Through education and philosophy. So Plato writes about it. Socrates was never, we don't have records of Socrates. He was sort of like, I don't know, he would hang out in town. He would be invited to parties. He would ask these questions. He had what was called the Socratic method. And so I'll read from the Wikipedia article about it and sort of break it down for you. So Elenchus is the central technique of the Socratic method. That means argument of disproof or refutation, cross-examining, testing, scrutiny, and so forth. The Latin for elenchus is used in English as the technical philosophic term. The most common adjectival form in English is elentic, elenchitic are also current. I never use that word. And we in St. John's we studied a bunch of Socrates and Plato. So in Plato's early dialogues, the elenchus is the technique that Socrates uses to investigate, for example, the nature or definition of ethical concepts such as justice or virtue. According to Vlastos, it has the following step. Socrates' interlocutor, and that's whoever he's talking to, asserts a thesis. For example, courage is endurance of the soul. Socrates decides whether this thesis is false and targets for refutation. Socrates secures his interlocutor's agreement for further premises. For example, courage is a fine thing, and ignorant endurance is not a fine thing. Step 4, Socrates then argues, and the interlocutor agrees. These further premises imply the contrary of the original thesis. In this case, it leads to courage is not the endurance of the soul. Step 5, Socrates then claims he has shown his interlocutor's thesis is false and its negation is true. One elenchic examination can lead to a new, more refined examination of the concept being considered. In this case, it invites an examination of the claim, courage is wise endurance of the soul. Most Socratic inquiries consist of a series of elenchi and typically end in puzzlement known as aporia. So we have a dialogue. So what happens is we're talking about, what is the good? What is art? What is beauty? What are UFOs? What is happening? How should we respond to it? And so there's a premise put forward, then Socrates offers a couple other premises, and you go, those seem very reasonable. Then there's a back and forth, and there's an elaboration of what those premises mean. At some point, there's an impasse. You go, wow, I never thought that this is the case and this is the case. How can they be? We don't know how to continue. At some point in time, right, this is the nature of logical discourse. At some point in time, you cannot continue the dialogue logically. You need fresh premises, and those often come from mythology, and we'll examine how that happens in Socratic dialogues, is the shift from logic to mythos, logos to mythos. And that's really important here because this is what needs to happen in the context of the United States and the greater empire dialogue that's happening. We are now in a logical impasse. We are now at a logical impasse. We are in a state of puzzlement that is known as aporia, and we need an injection of mythology and an injection of truth that is spoken about actual experience. So let's talk about the next thing, the cave. This is a famous allegory, a famous metaphor. And this comes from the Socratic dialogue, The Republic, written by Plato, again, talking about what's the best nature of a republic. So he gives this myth, and let's see, do we have any text? No, we just have this image. So I'll talk you through this. So Socrates offers this allegory, this metaphor of the cave as how we relate to the intellectual worlds. So there's the visible world and the intelligible world. And the visible world is what seems to be. The intelligible world is what is. It's appearance and knowledge. Phenomenon, noumenon, right? So this is UAPs, psychic spacecraft or whatever. So this is the difference we're talking about. So the metaphor here is that imagine this. You're in a cave. You're tied up like these guys on the left, and you cannot move your head. I guess you get fed or whatever. And you see on the wall light and shadow. Just you see the contrast between shadow and light. And they take the form of these images. In this case, you see horses, and it looks like there's a dog. Behind you, where you're tied, is this wall, and there are these people that have these shadow puppets, and there's a fire burning, and so the light of the fire is going over the shadow puppets, casting shadows on the walls. You think those shadow things are real, right? So imagine then breaking free, right? And saying, oh my gosh, actually the world that I thought that seemed to be is just an illusion, is actually caused by these higher order things. The form of that shadow of that horse is actually the shadow puppet being held by the jailers. But actually then, if you go outside, there's a whole nother realm, right, of experience. And then you might actually see a real horse. You might see the sun, which is, like the fire that you saw, like the light cast on the wall. So this is what we're talking about when we're talking about phenomenon and noumenon. This is literally what we're talking about. When we say phenomena, it implies a worldview where we go, this is the sense perception. I'm seeing those shadows on the wall, the light in the sky as a phenomena, the craft shutting down the nuclear silos, the strange psychic vision. We refer to this as phenomena. These are shadows cast upon the cave wall of our intellectual conscious mind as defined by the ontologies of our current worldview, based upon something real of a higher order reality being expressed. That's what we are implying. This is literally what we say when we say unidentified aerial phenomena. When we say the phenomena, we are associating ourselves with slaves in a cave looking at shadow puppets, when we need to be breaking free of this cave and listening to the testimony of people who have left the cave. This is very important. But he talks about in this allegory what would happen if someone came in, right? You leave the cave, oh my God, it blinds your eyes. You come back, you try telling your friends about what is in this cave. You go, well, it was like horses you see, but only another dimension. You can't talk about it. And in this way, we might actually recognize what is happening now in the historic moment when our friends and colleagues and reputable citizens are coming back from their experiences and saying, I talked to a psychic being that seemed to be very real, that talked to me about the nature of reality, and now they're talking about all these different dimensions and ways of knowing that don't make sense to you. But it's important to know that when we use the word phenomena, we're orienting ourselves to being slaves and prisoners in a cave. And we are actually invited to engage in a deeper exploration that will lead us to this vaster world of knowledge. Okay, so that's really what he's talking about. He uses a proportion, a divided line to describe this sort of thing, dividing things between the intelligible world that we know through knowledge, and these can be the world of forms, noumena, gnosis, you recognize that, gnosis, noumena, involving discursive reasoning. And then on the visible world, it's like common sense, it's imagination, it's visible things, it's images. So that's the allegory of the cave from Plato. I want to read about another interesting thing with Plato, and it's really, really important to understand the greater context here, because this is the moment, this is the historic moment that we are actually in as an empire. As an empire, we are in this moment, and I do not want us to repeat this history by creating martyrs of people who have our best interests at heart, right? Martyrs who have experienced a world outside of the cave and are just telling us about it. Because that's what happened to Socrates. He got charged with corrupting the youth because he was telling these stories. And in this dialogue, he's about to die. And they're having a conversation about, Socrates, why aren't you afraid to die? And he says, well, they have this dialogue, it's logical in nature, they go this way and that way, and then they reach a point, an aporia, a moment of puzzlement, where Socrates just has to say, well, he starts talking in myth, he starts using myth. This is, again, a true story that is told, right? And I'll just read from here, because it's going to be meaningful. So, for after death, they say, the genius of each individual, and this is Socrates, I believe that's talking. For after death, as they say, the genius of each individual to whom he belonged in life, leads him to a certain place in which the dead are gathered together, whence after judgment has been given, they pass into the world below, following the guide who is appointed to conduct them from this world to the other. And when they have there received their due and remained their time, another guide brings them back again after many revolutions of ages. Now this way to the other world is not, as Aeschylus says in the Telephus, and it goes on. Now the earth has diverse wonderful regions, and is indeed in nature and extent very unlike the notions of geographers, as I believe on the authority of one whom shall be nameless. What do you mean, Socrates says Simmias. I have myself heard many descriptions of the earth, but I do not know, and I should very much like to know in which of these you put faith. And I, Simmias, replied Socrates, if I had the art of Glaucus, would tell you, though I know not that the art of Glaucus could prove the truth of my tale, which I myself should never be able to prove. And even if I could, I fear, Simmias, that my life would come to an end before the argument was completed. I may describe to you, however, the form and regions of the earth according to my conception of them. That, said Simmias, will be enough. So here he is saying, argument is not enough. Let's use something else. So, and that something else is mythos, not logos, mythos, and that's narrative accounts of these things. Of that upper earth which is under the heaven, I can tell you a charming tale, Simmias, which is well worth hearing. And we, Socrates, replied Simmias, shall be charmed to listen to you. The tale, my friend, he said, is as follows. In the first place, the earth, when looked at from above, is in appearance streaked like one of those balls which have leather coverings in 12 pieces, and is decked with various colors, of which the colors used by the painters on earth are in a manner of samples. I may and must ask the gods to prosper my journey from this to the other world, and even so, and so be it according to my prayer. So he's describing the earth. This is the nature of mythos. And then I'm including this section from when he's about to die, because this is important. Then raising the cups to his lips, quite readily and cheerfully he drank off the poison. He was beginning to grow cold about the groin when he uncovered his face, and he had covered himself up, and said, and he said, they were his last words. He said, Crito, I owe a cock to Asclepius. Will you remember to pay the debt? And the debt shall be paid in full, said Crito. It's interesting, right? Crito's name reminds you of Creed, I believe, Crito. And who is Asclepius, right? Who is Asclepius? Well, Asclepius is the god of medicine and of dream. Of medicine and of dream. And he was something like a shape-shifting reptilian being that came and healed and taught things. He also demanded a testimony upon being healed, right? So when you went to a temple of Asclepius, you would talk to a priest. You say, I have these issues, whatever. The priest would say, okay, we'll initiate you into a dream. You'll incubate a dream. That'll heal you, provide insight, healing, whatever you need, right? Or you wake up from the dream, you might be healed, or you might have an interaction with a priest who gives you an interpretation. Regardless of how the healing happens, you then owe a thank offering to Asclepius. You owe Asclepius an offering. In this case, Socrates is owing a rooster, like a sacrifice to Asclepius. In other cases, it is written testimony on the walls of the temple. It is important to know that the cosmic dream sanctuary under which this presentation is offered uses the ancient Asclepions as a model for how sacraments can happen in this world. So I just wanted to call that out. And so here we're talking about, so Socrates is not afraid to die. He's not afraid to die. Why? Because of logic? No, not because of logic, but because of what he has heard and what he has experienced and is sharing with us through verbal testimony. And so he starts to die, and with his last words, he says, I owe something to Asclepius. Please pay the debt. And the debt is paid by someone whose name reminds us of creed, of credence, of belief, right? It's really interesting. So let's talk a little bit about myth, martyrs, and empire. Let us not repeat history, right? So we've got examples of martyrs that have provided verbal testimony about worldviews that may be different than ours, that imply a sense of ontological shock. We've got Socrates, we've got Christ, we've got Giordano Bruno, we've got countless indigenous, spiritual, and feminine sources of wisdom. This is literally what the empires have done. They destroy these sources of narrative, mythological data. And why do they do that? I mean, why do they do that? I think it's for control, because they don't want to shift. There's a revolution happening, right? So what are the characteristics of genociding empires? Well, they have a dogma that's in service to the empire. They punish the telling of stories or myth regarding non-human intelligences and transcendent states of consciousness, right? And they focus on the physical, observable world, right? This is where we find ourselves now, in the midst of a potentially genociding empire in relation to these stories. And this has been going on for as long as history has been recorded by such empires. So I would invite us, all of us, to step outside of the cave-like prison of the empire of mind, right? I'm not talking politically. I'm talking about concepts. I'm talking about categories of perception. I'm talking about ontologies. Step outside of it so that we can really exist in a world where we don't have to fear genociding empires, because we're simply talking about our interactions with non-human intelligences. Right? I think we're at this space in our history as a people. We need to do this. So let us fast forward about 2,000 years. Let's go to the Age of Enlightenment with Immanuel Kant. So he is really the most recent place where we get the definition of phenomena. This is where it's coming from. If you need to look for a historical moment outside of Socrates and talking about the allegory of a case, this is it. This is where it comes into modern usage. So reading again from Wikipedia, thank you. A phenomena is an observable event. The term came into its modern philosophic usage through Immanuel Kant, who contrasted it with noumenon, which cannot be directly observed. Kant was heavily influenced by Leibniz in this part of his philosophy, in which phenomena and noumenon serve as interrelated technical terms. Far predating this, the ancient Greek purist philosopher Sextus Empiricus also used the phenomena and noumena as interrelated technical terms. In his doctrine of transcendental idealism, Kant argued that space and time are mere forms of intuition which structure all experience, and therefore that while things in themselves exist and contribute to experience, they are nonetheless distinct from the objects of experience. From this, it follows that the objects of experience are mere appearances, aka phenomena, and that the nature of things as they are in themselves, aka noumenon, is consequently unknowable to us. It's important to know that Kant had a sense of dialectic here that unfolds through thesis and antithesis. So here's an example. A thesis: the world has, as to time and space, a beginning. Antithesis: the world is, as to time and space, infinite. Both are false. The world is an object of an experience. Neither statement is based on experience. Right? So this is an example of something you might be familiar with, thesis, antithesis, synthesis. This is sort of like what we're going through. This is an example of dialectic, the dialectic that we are invited to participate in now that we're talking about phenomena. So here's another example. Thesis: everything in the world consists of elements that are simple. Antithesis: there is no simple thing, but everything is composite. Both are false. things are objects of experience. Neither statement is based on experience. Thesis: there are in the world causes through freedom. Antithesis: there is no freedom, but all is nature. Both may be true. The thesis may be true of things in themselves, other than as they appear. The antithesis may be true of things as they appear. Thesis: in the series of the world causes, there is some necessary being. Antithesis: there is nothing necessary in the world, but in this series all is contingent. Both may be true. The thesis may be true of things in themselves, other than as they appear. The antithesis may be true of things as they appear. So once again, this is a description of phenomena, noumena, things as they appear, things in themselves. We're talking about phenomena, things as they appear to us. What is the actual experience underneath the thing in itself? How do we get to that? Well, it's through the process of dialectic. Dialectic is the process for us to understand these things and work with our categories of perception and understanding. And so you see there's a statement, a negation, and a synthesis here, an expression thereof. This is very similar to the structure of scientific revolutions that we've been talking about, where there's a paradigm, there's anomalies, there's an expansion. There's a paradigm, there's an anomaly, there's an expansion. So any conversation about dialectic is important to understand in the context of history, because our understandings about history and about politics sometimes arise out of this dialectic. So Karl Marx is one of the writers that talks about this. I'm reading from Wikipedia because thank you for the concise descriptions of what's going on here. So Marx and Engels, writing several decades after Hegel's death, proposed that Hegel's dialectic is too abstract. So he talks about synthesis like being. The dialectic is, this thesis would be being, the antithesis non-being, the synthesis is becoming, right? So this is how we're relating to these concepts of ontology and things like that. But here they're saying the mystification which dialectic suffers in Hegel's hands by no means prevents him from being the first to present its general form of working in a comprehensive and conscious manner. With him, it is standing on its head. It must be turned right side up again if you would discover the rational kernel within the mystical shell. In contradiction to Hegelian idealism, Marx presents his own dialectic method, which he claims to be the direct opposite of Hegel's method. My dialectic method is not only different from the Hegelian, but is its direct opposite. To Hegel, the life process of the human brain, i.e. the process of thinking, which under the name of the idea, he even transforms into an independent subject, is the demiurgos of the real world. And the real world is only the external phenomena form of the idea. With me, on the contrary, the ideal is nothing other than the material world reflected by the human mind and translated into forms of thought. So here, the expression here is understood that the dialectic takes place in and through history as opposed to abstract thought. So that's what Hegel puts forward, right? So we see that kind of in our understanding of scientific revolutions and things like that. In this case, like there's class dynamics that are expressed in Marx. And I know talking about Marx in the context of a U.S. empire is somewhat funny, but it's just really important to know that the use of the word phenomena is actually associated with dialectic, and that's actually associated with the political climate out of which this whole discussion arises, like the Cold War. That's what's happening. That's what's at stake. That's why Marx is in the this dialogue, is really because of that circular sort of talking about phenomena. We go back to Kant. Dialectic is how we engage with that logical process implied by using the word phenomena. Well, what is dialectic? Well, it's been interpreted in many ways, and we have experienced it through the Cold War experience. And so it's really, this is tying in philosophy and things like that. And that's why we need to do these inquiries, why we can't just accept words as such, but we need to analyze them with our intellect. All right, we're getting close to modern days. Thank you for being with me. So now we're talking about philosophic phenomenology. And I do just want to take a moment to have a sip of tea and to reflect on my own personal experience when I heard the word phenomenology. And I studied philosophy at St. John's College. We talked a lot about it. I never really understood what it was. It's been used oftentimes in papers. What is phenomenology? This is so strange. This is why I've done the inquiry. It's like, well, phenomenology is the study of phenomenon. Right? I was like, how pretentious is this, right? How pretentious. And it comes in part through this philosophic phenomenology, how we're relating to this. It's such a weird way to relate to a world, right? Just sort of reflecting on it, this level of pretension, actually, this level of philosophic thinking, abstracted from empirical, really experiences, is what brings us to a point where we are skeptical about dreams, right? I get to this when I think about dreams. There's a branch of philosophy that's like, let's be skeptical about dreams. People are making it up. We don't know. Dreams are a thing in themselves. Maybe we can never know, that sort of thing. Let's doubt it. But actually, it's very reasonable to trust people's reports on dreams. In this way, it's very reasonable, actually, to trust people's testimony about what's happening. Why should we doubt them, right? Why should we doubt them if they're reputable people, except they're talking about something that's outside of our worldview? Doesn't that mean we actually need to go through the work of expanding our worldview? I would say so. I would say that's the ethical principle here. I would say it's aggressive to demonize them or whatever. It's a bit of an aside. So after Kant, we get to philosophic phenomenology. This is something like a school. This is something like a method of research. And I'll just again read from Wikipedia. Phenomenology is the philosophic study of the structure of experience and consciousness. As a philosophic movement, it was founded in the early years of the 20th century by Husserl and was later expanded upon by a circle of his followers in Germany. It then spread to France, the United States, and elsewhere, often in contexts far removed from Husserl's early work. Phenomenology is not a unified movement. Rather, different authors share a common family resemblance, but also with many significant differences. Farina states, "A unique and final definition of phenomenology is dangerous and perhaps even paradoxical, as it lacks a thematic focus. In fact, it is not a doctrine nor a philosophic school, but rather a style of thought, a method, an open and ever-renewed experience having different results, and this may disorient anyone wishing to define the meaning of phenomenology. Phenomenology in Husserl's conception is primarily concerned with the systematic reflection on and study of the structures of consciousness and the phenomena that appears in acts of consciousness. Phenomenology can be clearly differentiated from the Cartesian method of analysis, which sees the world as objects, sets of objects, and objects acting and reacting upon one another." So that was really crucial. So we have shifted from UFOs, unidentified flying object, to UAP, unidentified aerial phenomena. And I'll just read the last sentence. Phenomenology can be clearly differentiated from the Cartesian method of analysis, which sees the world as objects, sets of objects, and objects acting upon and reacting upon one another. So we've now shifted from our Cartesian worldview, aka sort of Newtonian physics, right, to something else that involves consciousness. This is what the shift from UFO to UAP is. It is an orientation. And I would actually hazard to guess that most of Congress does not know the philosophic implications of the shift from object to phenomenon in that they are rejecting narrative data and that they are rejecting any data that doesn't come through physical senses regarding objects. So isn't that fascinating? We'll continue on to describe who the phenomenologists are that are notable. So we've got Hegel. He wrote the book Phenomenology of Spirit. We've got Husserl, writing ideas pertaining to a pure phenomenology and Cartesian meditations. We've got Heidegger with Being and Time, Sartre with Being and Nothingness, and then we got Merleau-Ponty, Phenomenology of Perception. So again, early 20th century, and Hegel was 1700s, but there you go. The final phase of phenomenology in tracing the history from Plato through the Enlightenment to through 20th century philosophy to the U.S. Congress is actually phenomenology as a research methodology. What is a research methodology, you may ask? Well, we've got some definitions from the American Psychological Association. A research methodology is a procedure for the formulation and evaluation of hypotheses that is intended to reveal relationships between variables and provide an understanding of the phenomena under investigation. In psychology, this generally involves empirical testing and takes the form of the scientific method. Okay, what is qualitative research? It is a method of research that produces descriptive, aka non-numerical data, such as observations of behavior or personal accounts of experiences. The goal of gathering this qualitative data is to examine how individuals can perceive the world from different vantage points. A variety of techniques are subsumed under qualitative research, including content analyses of narratives, in-depth interviews, focus groups, participant observation, and case studies, often conducted in naturalistic settings. So quoting from the paper Overview of Qualitative Research in the Journal of Healthcare Chaplaincy, the author writes here, its phenomenology roots are in the philosophic work of Husserl, Heidegger, and Ricoeur. This approach is based on several assumptions. 1. Meaning and knowing are social constructions, always incomplete and developing. 2. The investigator is a part of the experience being studied, and the investigator's values play a role in the investigation. And if you need to know anything more, you can turn to Dr. John Mack in his discussion of non-dual investigations rendered objectively for the palatability of those who have commissioned his work. So 3, bias is inherent in all research and should be articulated at the beginning. 4, participants and investigators share knowledge and are partners. Wouldn't that be beautiful? And 5, common forms of expression, e.g. words or arts, are important. And 6, meanings may not be shared by everyone. These are very similar to the meaning-making processes of dream work, actually. So, so now we have covered definitions, we've covered the history of phenomena and phenomenology. And the reflection I would offer here is that the word phenomenon invites intellectual participation. The word phenomena involves a statement of ontological significance. It invites intellectual categorization and invites participation in dialectic. So what is the statement of ontological significance? We've shifted from object, which says, hey, this is ontologically significant, this is a being as such. And it shifts it going, okay, this is an appearance, here is a collection of sense data, right? So I've seen a UAP. I saw 2 UAP, I don't know, this weekend, maybe, right? Is it a bird? Maybe. What I saw was a circle, very, very similar, not an ellipsoid, very, very similar to that tic-tac experience, moving at an angle to the direction. It's not directional. And I saw it go this, and I saw it go like this, and I saw it go like this. And oh, look, here's another one. It reminded me of the movements of birds on contrails. And there's another one, and it also went like this and like this. Then my wife started watching, and they started going straight away. And then they disappeared far in the distance. The other sense data is that the observable thing was very, very circular and regular. I could not discern any contour to the outside. So this is sense data. What is that? Is that a UFO? Well, I don't know, actually. Is it an object? Well, it likely is, but the sense data that I'm presenting is an experience of visual perception. Right? There was also sense data happening in terms of mental cognition. I didn't report on it, but I thought, how wonderful to see these things. I wonder, what are they? You know, maybe if they move this way or that way, they would have a different effect on me, that sort of thing. So I had contemplations. My wife also had contemplations when she saw those. And that is also sense data, but is often not talked about because we don't have an ontological category, right, for objects having psychical properties, meaning meaning that they have an impact on the observer. Right? So then from there we go, it invites categorization. Here's a phenomenon, let's categorize. Was it a bird? Well, I don't know. Was it a plane? No sound, no exhaust, right? So not a plane. What is it, right? And so when I offer that, we start categorizing. Then there's a participation in dialectic. So this is the statement, antithesis, synthesis process. So if you and I were engaging in this dialogue, that's what we'd go through. It's important to know that there is etiquette involved in dialectic. We are not arguing for the sake of arguing. We are not internet trolling each other here. We were actively listening to each other. We are engaged in a shared process of intellectual pursuit, of knowledge of things in themselves or of phenomena or things like that. So there's etiquette involved. And it's important to know what the etiquette is. So looking back to Plato, we actually verbally need to signify when we shift from discursive reasoning, from logic, to mythological or narrative ways of knowing. In that shift in ancient Greek times, you would shift from logos to mythos. But now we need to say, hey, this is a story I'm sharing with you, right? The other etiquette is intellectual detachment from the viewpoint and also the worldview or ontologies, the systems of concepts and categories we are using. So we are allowing for the negation of the expression of our experience for the sake of synthesis. So I go, okay, I saw those two dots. I think, well, I've gone through the categories I have. I think they are, for lack of a better term, UAPs, right? So UAPs or whatever. And then someone would go, oh, well, but did you know that birds behave in this way? I go, oh, no, I didn't know that. So now my categories of thoughts are different. Or I go, actually, that doesn't work that way. And so we can have a dialogue back and forth, even though we're talking about the negation of a categorical understanding of sense data, which has ontological significance. So this is really challenging for us because we get really tied up with our worldviews. So if you say, no, that's not a UFO, not a UAP, not a spaceship or whatever, I might feel sensitive about that. But it's important to have some level of intellectual detachment. This is not to say, however, that the experiencer needs to subject his own ontology to yours, right? Or whatever. Like, the experiencer actually is the authority about the significance of that experience. And so it's really important to understand that. So at some point you might say, hey, you didn't actually have ET contact. If they say something different, well, you probably should have a dialogue about that or respect actually the experiencer who's sharing testimony, right? Concepts about that are different. Testimony and interpretation of that testimony is in the experiencer's domain. Concepts and worldviews that we share in consensus are achieved through dialectic. That's what we're working at here. So we need to be empathetic with larger self. For example, we need to be aware of the triggering aspects or ontological shock. So in the case of Socrates, he says, oh, it takes forever to talk about that. This is a wonderful discussion, or you may change your worldview. Your worldview might actually change when you have this encounter, when you talk about the daimons, when you think about immortality of the soul. Likewise, when we talk about UFOs, our worldview might shift. And so we need to be empathetic with those things and say, hey, this dialogue actually might be triggering to you, and we need to be aware of that. So once again, let's consider where we are historically now. We've shifted from object to phenomenon. This sets a much different context. We are talking about the phenomenon. This is a euphemism that we've been using recently, maybe because of this shift, right? So let's talk about that in the U.S. Congressional Hearing. So we've got Bray, who is being questioned about the AOIMSG's activity, and he says, our aviators train as they would fight, so any intrusion that may compromise the security of our operations by revealing our capacities, our tactics, techniques, or procedures are of great concern to the Navy and the DoD. From the very beginning, we took these reports very seriously. We instituted a data-driven approach to the investigations where we could collect as much data as possible and use all available resources to analyze and make informed decisions on the best way to address our findings. Our main objective was to transition UAP efforts from an anecdotal or narrative-based approach to a rigorous science and technology engineering-focused study. So I would actually challenge that the shift of objective from narrative-based accounts to from narrative anecdotal based accounts to rigorous science is actually not rigorous science. It is limited science driven by a worldview. Let's continue. This data-driven approach requires input from a wide variety of sources. In the early stages, the task force worked to standardize the reporting mechanisms and processes to make it as easy as possible for personnel to report any engagement so that we were getting that wide range of reporting that we needed. The direct results of those efforts have been increased reporting with increased opportunities to focus on number of sensors on any objects. So once again, he's talking about objects, he's talking about sensors, he's talking about rejection of narrative anecdotal-based evidence. However, when you look at the quantitative analysis of the qualitative phenomenological study of this phenomenon, we see that the only way of receiving data regarding the psychical experiences are anecdotal. We shift from logos to mythos once again, and he is rejecting mythos. This is extremely concerning when the phenomenon, by its very nature, is psychical in nature, and the objective expressions of that phenomena are more consistent with a quantum mechanic worldview than a Newtonian worldview. Quantum mechanics, for those who don't understand it, imply that consciousness is a causal agent in things that are extremely non-local, that are extremely bizarre, that may actually serve as the basis for the highly strange activity of these so-called UAPs. So fast forward a bit, we've got Dr. Winstrup talking, questioning him. Are we capable or have we made any breakthroughs, or anyone made any breakthroughs to be able to cite something or make some determination at all about its composition, whether it's solid or a gas? Is there any such capability, right? So now he's applying categories of sense perception to the phenomena as reported by sense data, right? Well, gas is a physical object. It can be. Do you see where I'm going with this? I'm trying to determine what it is we're looking at, so if we can decide if something is a solid or a gas. And have there been any conclusions on its capabilities, like its like its capabilities of movements, of turning, of going 180 degrees or 90-degree turns, anything along those lines that we've been able to determine. So this is like, is it physical? Can we determine its physical properties? And then Bray answers, within the, and again, I should point out that there is not a single explanation for UAP. There are a lot of different things that are unidentified phenomena, right? So what's going on here? He's not able to say what's going on, but we yearn for a categorization. He's saying, oh, okay, let's actually return back to the definition of phenomena, which is a ontologically looser definition than object, right? What's there? We don't know, right? That's basically the answer. But the coming back to the sense of being unidentified phenomena does invite this intellectual activity known as dialectic. So again, let's now we've got a dialogue between LaHood and Moultrie. LaHood is a congressman. Moultrie is the other director of the AOIMSG program. LaHood goes, "Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and want to thank the witnesses for being here today. Obviously, this topic of UAPs has attracted a lot of interest in people that are curious about this hearing today. As we talk about, and I would say there's a lot of what I would call amateur interest groups that are involved in the UAP field. My question is, when there is unsubstantiated claims or manufactured claims of UAPs or any kind of false information that's put out there, what are the consequences for people that are involved with that or groups that are involved with that?" So this is included because this sounds to me like the persecution of Socrates 2,500 years ago by the Athenian empires for corrupting the youth, for sharing his mythological stories about interactions with non-human intelligences, right? So I'm not talking about fraudulent claims. Here, fraudulent claims, of course, should be persecuted according to laws and things like that. But how do we determine disinformation? How do we determine false information? How do we say unsubstantiated claims? Well, unsubstantiated claims, literally, if we go back to Socrates, his claims about interaction with non-human intelligence, his claims about knowing the nature or the immortality of the soul, which is the reason why he was courageous enough to drink that poison, right? Those claims are unsubstantiated by his own admission, right? We cannot substantiate mythological claims. We can share those stories, and this should not be punishable by law because we have First Amendment rights, free speech. There's a separation between church and state. So this sounds to me very similar or dangerously close to a quasi-religious doctrine that this world is simply scientificism or something like that, positivism. This is the dominant culture, the old paradigm speaking and wanting to punish something that it cannot understand. But we need to rely upon the testimony of people in phenomenological investigations. That is the essential nature of phenomenology, is listening to testimony, of anecdote, of narrative, of gathering qualitative data, in addition to whatever sense and objective data we can have. That's a bit of an aside. Thank you. So Moultrie responds, "It is important because we are attempting as this hearing as has drawn out to understand one, what may just be natural phenomena, two, what may be sensor phenomenology or things that were happening with sensors, three, what may be legitimate counterintelligence threats to place that we have or bases or installations or security threats to our platform. And anything that diverts us off of what we have with the resources that we have been allocated, send us off to these spurious chases and hunts that are just not helpful." So LaHood says, so just taking that a step further, so that misinformation, false narratives manufactured, so what are the consequences? Are there legal consequences? Are there examples that you can give us where people have been? Are there legal consequences? where are there examples that you can give us where people have been held accountable by this information or disinformation? Moultrie says, no, he doesn't know. Maybe you should talk to lawmakers about that. But I just need to talk about this because the sense of persecution of people in this space that have unsubstantiated and unprovable claims that are of a psionic nature that feel highly strange, right? The characteristic of these stories is their high strangeness. They are bizarre in the way dreams are bizarre. They are unpalatable even to the experiencer's psychology, much less the consensus worldview. So when we think about persecuting people based upon a consensus reality definition of disinformation, right? This is a challenging, this is a complicated matter. Of course, there should be consequences for deliberate misinformation, deliberate messing with the intelligence agencies, but sharing your story, sharing literally what has happened to you, even if it is highly strange, should also be protected under First Amendment rights. Otherwise, we repeat history. Otherwise, we'll create martyrs. And I don't think it would be advantageous for us to create martyrs in this field. I would pray that we are beyond that as a society. All right. So my conclusions are that Congress is using phenomena euphemistically, primarily because they focus on sensor data and not narrative data, logos, not mythos. They're looking at physical objects, not psychical experiences. And they find that narratives that are unsubstantiated and not backed up by an array of sensor data may be deemed information, and reading into the lines may be punishable, right? Wow. So we actually have the facts of the matter, right? Narrative and anecdotes are evidence and a way of knowledge. Right? The phenomena is both psychical and physical, and that persecution based upon narratives or mythologies is unethical and leads to martyrs like Christ, like Socrates, like Giordano Bruno, like the indigenous populations, sources of feminine wisdom. And I don't want to see us do that. So we are actually using the word phenomena here of UAP in a euphemistic way, right? That's what the conclusions are. How can you not see that? People have been saying it's cyclical in nature for decades. There's study about it. There is really, if you look at John Mack talks about it. I mean, there's a consistent narrative around this that involves non-human intelligences. It's uncomfortable for the consensus reality, and therefore we use the phrase phenomena and unidentified aerial phenomena as a euphemism, right? So is it knowable? Is this knowable? So I just want to end with this point, really. Is the phenomenon knowable? Well, actually, you're invited to discover that in your own life. You're invited to explore that in your own life. But I would say that let's turn back to the Beyond UFO study. They did a lifestyle inventory change. So since I first became interested in my UFO experience, the desire to help others has increased. Compassion for others, appreciation of ordinary things, sensitivity to the suffering of others has increased, concern with spiritual matters, desire to achieve a higher state of consciousness, concern with the welfare of the planet, understanding with what is life all about, my personal sense of purpose, my concern with ecological matters, these all kind of universally increase. There's no sense of decrease or minor senses of decrease with this, but there is a large increase of these things. And so in some way, shape, or form, we know the quality of a plant by its fruit. And this is the fruit of the phenomena, is an increased awareness, an increased empathy, an increased sensitivity to the needs of the planet. And therefore, I put forward that it is a valuable thing to pursue and understand, even if it is uncomfortable, even if we have to go through scientific revolutions, even if you have to reconcile your own worldview with the testimony of your neighbors that is highly strange. It is worthwhile doing because this is the fruit of the phenomena, this appreciation of nature, a concern for the welfare of the earth. right? Compare that with the fruits of the empire, right, of military-industrial complex. It's a really different situation we're in. So that's really important to know. So I'll end with conclusions. So when you hear the word phenomena, please know that you are invited to intellectual participation through a technical, logical dialogue we call dialectic. Know that your narrative story is a meaningful way of knowledge. Please do not repeat history by creating martyrs, by persecuting people for talking about mythologies, right? Please know that categories like physical or psychical have the same epistemological status as mythology, right? They are derivative or are relating to a predefined worldview, right? These are categories of perception we're using to make sense of sense data. Categories of perception are really defined by the intellect and should expand or contract according to the dialectic based upon inquiry into the sense data of phenomenon, right? Please know that you must engage to advance humanity through scientific revolution, which is courageous because it involves ontological shock. When you hear the word phenomena, you will know that it is an invitation to advance humanity through scientific revolution, through exploring our ontologies, our concepts of this world. And ultimately, please know that this inquiry, the engagement with the phenomena, will lead to a better world and greater knowledge. There are ethics associated with this. Please verbally acknowledge when you shift from logical discussion to mythological domains of dialogue. Go, oh, we're talking about quantitative sensor data. Now I'm going to tell you a story about my own UFO sighting, right? You shift in language, you signify that to people. Please use actual categories when applicable. So let's stop using the word phenomenon euphemistically, right? Say spaceship, not UAP. Right? Say psychic space people in spacecraft as opposed to non-human intelligence in UAP, if you know that to be the case. If not, there's actually a wide range of phenomena associated with UAPs, right? These can actually be beings in their own right. They can be all these different things. And actually, the people who experience them have a really good sense as to what is going on. And if they use words that were applicable and not euphemistic, we would actually have a much better understanding of what's going on. Please respect the experiencer as the authority regarding the ontological significance of the narrative. So I might tell you a thing that seems dreamlike to you, but I'm saying this is real, and this is a real consciousness experience, this is a real experience in waking life, whatever. I tell you those things. Please accept that and accept me as the authority of that significance. And same with you. We're sharing our testimony. Let's respect each other, right? Please, when you feel triggered, know that it is a choice and an invitation to choose to expand your worldview. And understand that phenomena implies an invitation to an intellectual process. When we use the word phenomena, when Congress uses the word phenomena, when scientists use the word phenomena, please know that it is an actual invitation. This is the historic, philosophic, political context out of which the word phenomenon comes, is an invitation to an intellectual process that we call dialectic. And you're invited to participate. We need your testimony. We need your myth. We need your narratives in here. We need your working through of applying categories and establishing ontologies. And that's what is implied when we say phenomena. It's an invitation to process. It's not, oh, it's just data out there. Oh, it's just science stuff. It's actually inviting you as an active participant in the intellectual activity of humanity to help make sense of this together. So thank you for being here with me. Thank you for going on this journey to inquire into the word usage of phenomena as a euphemism for psychic space people in spacecraft, right? This may have been quite a journey for you. You may have opened to ideas that you may not have opened before. You may have learned a lot about philosophy, phenomenology. You may be surprised that you can, you know that the use of the word phenomena actually implies this whole worldview and history. That's really what the shift is about, right? The shift is inviting you. And I really do commend whoever shifted the language from UFO to UAP. I commend them from shifting a sort of the object to phenomena. And I would invite anyone to take that up. I mean, it seems to me to be the kindness of some of the, I don't know where it comes from. I just suspect that somebody in the processes of defining words was able to sneak in this beautiful invitation. And so I think whoever snuck this beautiful invitation into our political dialogue surrounding our empire, and so thank you. The whole thing, right? The whole thing really is around this is important to talk about because of this beautiful planet that we're on. You see this image here of the Earth. This is from Earthrise, the image from the Apollo 8 mission to the moon, taking a photo of the Earth. And it's an invitation to know that your worldview can change in a moment, right? By seeing this image, right, the whole world saw itself in a different way. By engaging with the phenomenon and engaging in our intellectual activity and process around that, we can actually shift our understanding of who we are in this world, right? That's what the invitation is to shift, to go through the scientific revolution, to go through a dialectic, a historical dialectic of going from not knowing to knowing to embodiment, that sort of thing. And so I just want to invite you to say yes to doing this, to say yes to reporting on your own personal narrative experience, because that's really welcome in the dialogue. That's really needed, right? When the empires are talking about persecuting, we need to stand up and say, hey, actually, I've had interactions with non-human intelligence. I've had interactions with psychic people in spacecraft, even though that sounds really ridiculous, even though that's not how I imagine, even though the events were not how I imagined this thing to unfold, even though they were highly estranged. This is my experience, and we need to actually say that to such a degree that our categories of perception start shifting, that our ontological status, our ontological significance, our ontological understanding of the world starts shifting. Go, okay, things can be more than just objects. Things can be more than just physical things. Phenomena can involve both the data from physical sensors, engineered sensors, and also the data from this sensor, right? Which some people may actually say has been engineered. So it's really just a matter of opinion. It's a shift of perspective. And that's what this image here is offering. That's what our narrative data, when brought together and respected, can do. That's even what the sensor data from all the fancy radars they have could do. And the first step here is just saying yes to the invitation put forward by the use of the word phenomenon. So once again, thank you for being with me on this journey. I know it's been long, but it's really worthwhile, and I think it can really change our world for the better, that we can really elevate our nation and our world to a beautiful republic, let's say. A beautiful and good republic. And I really do believe in the possibility here. I do really believe in the politicians. I really do believe in this dialogue, this beautiful national dialogue that we are having. And I just really am strong sometimes because of the my fear of repeating history. But I really don't think that'll happen. I'm sharing my personal testimony, understanding, right? I'm understanding, right, that this has often led to martyrdom, and that's a risk I'm willing to take, but I don't actually think that's a risk nowadays. I think there are sufficient mechanisms within the worldview and within the congressional bodies and things like that to put forward such a beautiful invitation as that which we receive in simply the euphemistic usage of the word the phenomenon. With that, I pray that you really do have experiences of beauty, of goodness, all of the days of our lives together. With that, good night.